What's up guys, and welcome to the $800 stream PC build. So this is a PC that is designed to be the cheapest possible PC to stream with a single PC setup at good settings. There is a full parts list in the description down below, and I'm going to be showing you how to build exactly that part list. I'm going to go through all the parts now and explain why I picked them. We are building in the Fractal Design Focus Mini G case, and we are running a GeForce RTX 2060. Now, a lot of people are going to ask why the RTX 2060 over the cheaper 1070. The reason is the new NVENC encoders. I did a video about that, which you can find in a playlist down below, explaining why the 20 series cards are so much better for streamers and single stream PC setups. We are running an Intel i3. It's the first i3 build I've ever done in the 8 series, 8100. This actually gets surprisingly good gaming performance when combined with the 2060. At 1080p, you can run almost any game at high to max settings at 60 plus frames per second, which is going to allow you to stream at 60 frames per second with the new NVENC encoders and get a really nice looking stream. We're going for Corsair because I trust Corsair more than any other RAM manufacturer. I've never had an issue. DDR4, 16 gigabytes of 2400 megahertz RAM. We're not going for the super overpowered RAM because honestly, we can't afford it. If we're trying to build a PC for $800, you cannot afford to go for more than 16 gigabytes of more than 2400 megahertz RAM, just because RAM is so ridiculously expensive right now. We're actually using a laptop hard drive because it is a decent laptop hard drive. It's 5400 RPM, which is a little slow, but it's a hybrid drive. So it does have an SSD partition on it, which allows you to speed up your Windows boots and your game loading times, while also having a drive that's going to last a long time, and it's incredibly cheap. We saved a lot of money getting this drive. The first upgrade I would suggest for this system, if you're going to upgrade it, would, however, be a dedicated SSD for your operating system and whatever game you're playing at the time. And you can just transfer the games back and forth, juggling a little bit, but again, we're on a budget, so that's the plan. We're going for the MSI B360M Pro VH motherboard. This is like a business Pro Series motherboard, but it's actually surprisingly good for gaming. Now we're going for a B360 chipset because the H350 chipset is garbage for streamers because you lose some of your RAM, you lose some of your bandwidth, you actually lose an entire RAM channel. You go to single channel RAM, which is no good. You also go down and you lose some of your PCIe Express lanes, which is going to suck. If you want to have an internal capture card like the HD60 Pro from Elgato, you're going to suffer. If you want that internal capture card and you're losing those PCIe Express lanes, that's going to make you suffer on your graphics. So you really want to go for a B360. It's not worth going for the Z370 or the Z390 because, frankly, you can't overclock this CPU anyway. So why go for an overclocking capable motherboard when you can't overclock your CPU? And finally, again, Corsair, I really do trust them. They're a great company. We're going with the Corsair TX 550M power supply. I would say with power supplies, I always stick to either Corsair or Silverstone. They are the only power supplies that I've never, ever had an issue with. And power supplies are so important in your system because if your power supply goes, it can fry every component in your system. So don't cheap out on your power supply. A lot of system integrators do that. They give you these great wall power supplies or whatever from these cheap companies. They're not even rated 80 plus bronze. This is an 80 plus gold semi-modular power supply, and it's really affordable. As I said, there is a parts list down below. I just want to explain why we're using the parts we're using, and let's get into the build. Before every build, I like to make sure I have all the tools I need. To build any PC, you basically need a Phillips head screwdriver. Everything else is useful but not required, but you're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. I like to use two, so I have my iFixit one for smaller screws and then a full-size one for the larger screws and the thumb screws on the back of the case. It's also really helpful to have a tray or a bowl to put screws in. Just stops them from rolling all over your table or building surface and stops you from losing any of your screws. And finally, in order to have neatness, I like to use cable ties and a pair of clippers or scissors to cut the ties to length after using them. You're going to have a much easier time building your PC if you start with the motherboard, put everything that goes into the board into it before you put it in your case, and then assemble the PC in the case. This makes things a lot less fiddly and a lot simpler and safer to do. We're going to start with our CPU installation. You don't want to do anything to the motherboard other than flip this lever up and reveal your CPU socket. In order to place the CPU in the socket, you want to align the little gold triangle on the corner of the CPU with either the triangle or the dot on your motherboard. In this case, we have a dot. It's really important here not to use any pressure. You want to place your CPU in the socket very gently and make sure everything is lined up, and then you lower the lever back into place, making sure to hook the bracket under the screw on the motherboard, push the lever back down below its retention bracket, and the black cover for your motherboard socket should pop off and be ready to be put aside in case you ever want to sell on the motherboard secondhand, or if the motherboard needs to be returned for some reason, you will need that to protect the socket. Next up, we're going to install the stock CPU cooler that came with our 8100. This is plenty to cool the chip as it isn't overclockable, and it's super important to note that the thermal paste is pre-applied to this cooler, so please don't apply any extra thermal paste. It will cause mixing and issues. So what you want to do is line your CPU cooler up with the 4 holes on your motherboard, and then just push the 4 push pins into place. This is the easiest type of cooler to install. It's super simple. Anybody could do it. Once you have pushed them all into place, if you turn the motherboard over, you will see that the little feet have popped out and are securely attached to your motherboard, and the cooler is installed. Finally, the fan on the cooler is going to need power, so you want to plug the fan into the CPU fan header at the top of your motherboard, right next to the RAM slots. Now it's time to install our RAM. This motherboard only has 2 slots, and we have 2 RAM sticks, so it's super simple knowing which slot to put our RAM into. In order to install RAM, all you need to do is push these 2 little plastic tabs out in order to allow us to put the RAM into place. Make sure you have your RAM the right way up. It will only fit in one direction, and then push it down firmly. It really can be pushed quite hard without breaking, but don't use too much force as we don't want to damage anything. Everything should click into place and the slot will automatically close itself again, and that is your RAM installed and ready to go. Next up, it's time to get our case ready for our motherboard. So in order to open the front panel of our case, we are going to undo these 2 thumb screws. If they are a little tight, which they were in my case, feel free to use a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen them and then undo them, and they will be captive thumb screws, so they will be connected to that front panel. You will not have to completely remove them. Once you've loosened them, you can easily slide the front panel off by sliding it away towards the back of the PC case. Put it off to the side somewhere safe, and we're going to move on to installing our standoffs. Some cases have their motherboard standoffs pre-installed. Ours does not, so we do need to install all these little standoffs that you will find in the handy-dandy box with all of your motherboard screws and goodies. Included in the box is a standoff installation tool. This is a Phillips head screw slot attached to a cylinder, and inside that cylinder you can drop in your hexagonal standoffs. I like to install every standoff into my case, so all you need to do is use a Phillips head screwdriver to screw each and every one into place. I do like to put them all in, even the ones that aren't used for my current motherboard, just in case I ever decide to use this case for a different build in the future, and I don't want to have to go looking for my standoffs in a box somewhere in my office. It's far easier just to put them in the case and leave them there. They're not going to be in the way, and they're not going to interrupt with your build at all, even the ones that aren't used for your current motherboard. After screwing in your standoffs, there's one more step before we put our motherboard into our case, and that's to install our I/O shield. It's very simple to install your I/O shield. All you want to do is find the side that is clearly meant for the outside of the case, which is labeled with all the parts and things like that. You want to go from the inside of the case and putting the audio jacks at the bottom of your case. You want to push it in until all of the little clips click into place. It's a very simple process, and you can see me doing it here from a rather poor camera angle. I do apologize for that. And your case is now ready for your motherboard. Now it's finally time to see this computer begin to come together. Let's slide our motherboard into our case. This is super simple. All you want to do is bring it in at a slight angle so that all of the ports slide into the matching holes on your I/O shield, and pop the motherboard down. This case does have this handy dandy peg down here in the bottom right area that shows you when your motherboard is in place correctly, because it comes through one of the motherboard screw mounts. Now that we've got the motherboard in place, we are going to need some screws to hold it there. That's what those standoffs were for earlier. They are all threaded internally with screw holes. So we're going to take the motherboard screws that were included with our case box and screws. They're the ones without the hexagonal top and lip. They're the small round-headed screws. And we're going to use them to screw the motherboard into place through each and every one of these mounting holes. Some people do like to just do 3 or 4, but I really like to fully mount my motherboard just so I know that the build is super secure, and why not when we have those holes and those screws in order to maximize the quality of our build. Now that our motherboard is nice and secure, it's time to install our graphics card. First things first, we need to remove these brackets on the back of the case that are blocking the ports that the graphics card's going to mount to, and also keep those thumb screws because they're what we're going to use to secure the graphics card to the case. Our graphics card is going to be going into this 1x16 slot at the top of our motherboard's PCIe lanes, and we're going to remember to push this little tab down to release the slot, just like when we were installing the RAM, and then we can easily push our graphics card into place. That will automatically, just like with the RAM, pop back up, locking the graphics card into the PCIe slot, and then we want to screw our thumb screws back into the back of the case where they were previously holding in those brackets. This will keep our graphics card nice and securely held into our case and into our motherboard. Our computer now has its CPU, its GPU, its RAM, and its case all ready to go. So there's one more component that needs to go in before we start cabling everything up. And that component is our hard drive. This is where our OS and all of our games are going to sit for now, as we only have one hard drive in this system. We are using a 2.5-inch drive, but a 3.5-inch drive will fit in the same tray just as easily. With a 2.5-inch drive, which will generally be one of these smaller drives or an SSD if you've managed to buy that upgrade for this system, you want to line it up with the holes on the back of the tray and then screw the same screws you used to attach the motherboard to the case in order to attach the hard drive to the tray. With larger 3.5-inch hard drives, they actually just slot directly into this tray using the metal pegs on the side of the tray to hold them in place. Once you've got your hard drive screwed into your tray or just clipped into the tray in the case of bigger 3.5-inch drives, you want to just slide it into the bay and it is ready to go. Our motherboard only has one extra fan header, but the case comes with 2 extra fans by default, and we might want to add a third one later for better cooling. So in this build, I have included a 3-way fan splitter. You're going to want to plug the end, which looks square and has little holes in it, into the fan header now, right next to our CPU fan that we plugged in earlier, and later we will be passing it through the cutout in the case in order to manage all of our cables super nicely and connect the 2 fans. Now for the ultra fiddly bit that everybody hates, connecting the front I/O of our case to our motherboard. This is super fiddly and super annoying, so I am going to go through it with a manual on the screen showing you exactly where to plug everything in, and this is what allows our power button, reset button, front audio jack, and front USBs to work. Luckily with this, almost everything will only fit into the slot it's made for, so you can't accidentally plug a USB header into an audio header, and so everything should be pretty simple. We are going to pass our USB header and our audio header through the back of the case and then out through a cutout just to make the cables much neater. So we're going to start by plugging in our USB 3.0. That's this cable with the blue end. This plugs in just next to your 24-pin power connector on your motherboard, right above your graphics card on the right-hand side here. It will only fit in one way and can be a little stiff, so you can use a bit of force, but please don't push too hard and damage the pins. Now that we've attached that, let's do the super fiddly front I/O. I think here it's actually easier for me to show you a cutout of the motherboard manual to show you exactly where each pin goes. The pins are clearly labeled on the pins themselves, and it's much easier to use this than it would be to watch this video and try and see what I'm doing really close up. So I'll have those things side by side just in case you want to follow the video, but I really do advise that you just follow this image on screen. In order to get the rest of this front I/O done, we're going to need to flip over the case and take a look in the back in order to keep our cables nice and neat. In order to keep cabling neat, we always want to keep the cables exactly where they're meant to be. If you try and do all your cable organization at the end of the build, you're going to have trouble. So for now, we're going to pull the excess cabling very gently of the USB 3.0 and the front I/O cables that we just attached into the back of the case because that's where we want them. Then we're going to take the HD audio and USB cables that we passed into the back earlier and pass them through this cutout just to make sure everything is in the right place. Flipping the case back over to the front again, we're going to now connect our HD audio and USB. HD audio connects on the very bottom left of our motherboard, as you can see right here, and our USB can connect to either of our USB headers, which are very clearly labeled with the letters USB in the pin sockets themselves. I chose to use the USB header closest to the cutout because it leaves the least cable in the front of our case where we have a clear case window to look at. We're going to also take this opportunity to pass that Y-splitter for the fan through the cutout to the back of the case, and we're also going to pass the cables from the fans, the connectors themselves, into the back of the case so that we can connect all of that behind everything so that none of those cables are visible at the front of our build. Flipping the case back over, it's time to connect our fans to that Y-splitter. So we're going to run these cables up the side of the case nice and neatly, and then along the top. We have a lot of spare slack with these cables, and this case has a fair amount of anchor points for our cable management, but if we pass the Y-splitter underneath the cables from the front of the case and the fans up the side, we can keep this really, really neat and out of the way, and also leave one of our fan splitter attachments free for an additional fan in the case later on if we want to just get that extra cooling and airflow. Super easy to do, and you can bundle the cables up and then hide them under this lip at the top of the case. Now that we've got these fan cables where we want them, in an area where no more cables are going to pass, we want to hold them in place. There's actually a CD drive cage in this case that we are not using, so I'm going to use the holes in that as a makeshift cable anchor for our cable tie. We're going to pass a cable tie through these holes and around the cables, zipping them into place really easily and really neatly. This is a really good tip for keeping your case nice and clean, and that's to cable tie as you go. If you need to, you can always cut these ties to add cables to the bundles later. Wasting cable ties is not a big deal when they cost less than a cent each. Let's continue this cable management by running these other cables nice and straight and try and line them up with our little cable tie anchors on the case. You can pass those cable ties then through those anchors around the cables, keeping them nice and tight and bundled and out of the way for when we start routing our power, and keeping them nice and flat to the back of the case, giving us a really, really neat look in the final product. Before installing our power supply, we're going to want to plug our SATA cable into the back of our hard drive. This is what takes the data between our motherboard and CPU and our hard drive, and it was included in the motherboard box. We want to plug the L-shaped side into the back of our hard drive. It is keyed and it will be L facing downwards with the cable facing down, and then just pass it through the grommet in the center of our case. You can bundle this in with the rest of the cables if you want to cut and re-tie the cable tie, or you can just tie it to the power cable later once we've got that in place. With our cables nice and neat, it's time to add our power supply to the system. This is what's going to provide power to every single part, so obviously it's pretty vital. We're using a semi-modular power supply here, which means that some of the cables do come pre-attached, but a lot of the optional and less used power cables aren't attached by default, so we can pick and choose which ones we use, and we don't fill our case with a bunch of useless cables. Because of these permanently attached cables, we can't mount all of our power cables to our motherboard and graphics card before we mount our power supply, so we're going to mount our power supply to the case first. This is super easy to do. You slide it into place, fan side down, and then attach it to the back of the case with just 4 screws. These screws are the ones I talked about earlier with the hexagonal head and the slightly wider base. These are going to screw into the 4 mounting points on the back of your power supply, as you can see here. With our power supply installed in the case, it's time to get everything plugged in. We're going to route the cables through the back of the case to make everything nice and neat, and we're going to start with our 24-pin power cable. This is going to plug into the right-hand side of the motherboard in that big, long power slot we saw earlier. This cable is the large one encased in mesh on this power supply, and what we're going to want to do is run it through the gap on the right-hand side of the motherboard, so you just want to route it through the back and then through this gap. It might be a little tight with the cables you already have there. Just make sure you pull it through nice and gently so you don't damage those cables, and then push it as flat to the case as possible. We'll be cable tying this in place later. In order to keep things efficient, before we actually plug that in, we're going to route our CPU power cable too. This one is super easy to route as it's much flatter and thinner. I do like that with these Corsair power supplies. They used to be wrapped in mesh with many power supplies, but they've made this one super easy. We're going to be routing this around the edge of the case and then up through that cutout at the top that we used for the fan splitter earlier. So we're going to start by cable tying it to this horizontal slot here, and we can also cable tie down the USB and HD audio cables that we used earlier, just to keep everything nice and flat to the back of the case and keep everything in a bundle. Now that we've run it horizontally, we want to tuck it into the edge of the case here to hide as much of the cable as possible, because a neat case is a happy case, and we will have a much easier life if we keep things nice and neat. And then finally, we pass it through that cutout at the top of the case. The edge of the case here will actually keep this cable really nicely in place, so cable ties aren't necessary to hold that in. Now that we've routed the pre-connected cables, it's time for the optional cables. We're going to need two different optional cables here. We're going to need our eSATA power. This is the power for our hard drive. And we're going to need our PCIe Express power for our graphics card. We'll start by plugging the power for the hard drive into the back of the hard drive here. It is keyed, it will only go in one way up, and it's very obvious which end of this cable should go into the hard drive and which one should then be passed through the back of the case, ready to be plugged into our power supply. And that's it for the back of the case. Let's take a moment to admire our cable management here and how neat everything looks, because it is important. Again, a neat case is a happy case. You will have a much better time with any upgrades or future changes to your system if you keep your cables nice and neat and well-rounded. Nobody wants spaghetti in the back of their case. Putting the back panel on should be super easy with these nicely routed cables. Just slide it into place and then screw on the thumb screws that were captive to the back panel. Flipping our case to the front side for the last time, it's time to plug everything in. We're going to start by connecting our eSATA power to the back of our power supply. This can be a little fiddly, but it should be easy. It's at the very far back of the power supply, and then just tuck the cables into the bottom of the case. This is the best we can do with the cable management available, as this case has no power supply shroud. There's one more cable to connect to our power supply, and that is our PCIe power. On one end of the PCIe power, you should see two 6+2 pins, and on the other, there's a singular 8-pin plug. The singular 8-pin plug is going to go into our power supply. It plugs in just like our eSATA power cable did into one of the PCIe labeled slots. This is on the bottom at the back, and you can see that it can be a little fiddly to get in here, but it should be easy enough. With it plugged in, we're going to use one of these 8-pin connectors to connect to our RTX 2060. Line the 2 and the 6 pin up, and with the clip facing upwards on the graphics card, push it into place gently. Lining the 2 up when they are disconnected can be a little tricky, but just be patient with it, and again, please don't force it. Damaging these pins could damage your most expensive component in your entire system, and you really don't want that. Once it's plugged in, you can push the cables to the bottom of the case just like before, and then neatly tie the excess cabling that has the extra 8-pin connector to the back of your cable to hide it completely. Plugging in our 8-pin CPU connector is super easy. You want the pin facing upwards towards the edge of the motherboard, and then it just clicks into place super gently and super easily. This will only plug in one direction on your motherboard, so please be very, very careful and gentle, but a little bit of firm pressure might be needed to get it to click all the way in. The same goes for the 24-pin power cable. You want the clips facing outwards towards the edge of the motherboard, and then you want to use gentle but firm pressure to push it all the way in until it clicks. Finally, we're going to connect that SATA cable for the hard drive data to our motherboard. As you can see, there are two SATA plugs right below our USB 3.0 that we connected earlier, and we just want to click the SATA cable into place on that. Again, it's keyed just like on the back of the hard drive, so it will only click in one direction. Everything is now connected and ready to go. We do have one more thing to tie in place here just to keep the cables nice and neat at the front. This case does lack any kind of cable management at the front of the case to hide these cables, especially the lack of the PSU shroud, but it's to be expected in a budget case, and I think that we did pretty well here with this cable management. Everything looks pretty neat, and it's time to pop our front cover back on, screw it back into place with the thumb screws, and our $800 system is completed and ready to go. This build really turned out surprisingly neat and was exceptionally easy, so for a beginner build for your first PC, I can recommend this very highly, and it's going to be a fantastic stream machine. Now that we've finished building this little beast, it's time to talk about performance. This is a surprisingly powerful machine, both for gaming and for streaming. The RTX 2060 is an incredibly performant card at its price point, easily matching and sometimes outclassing the previous generation's 1070 card. The i3-8100 is a surprisingly performant processor for gaming, and while it is a shame that Intel still insists on locking down their lower-end processors and preventing overclocking, it has respectable boost clock scores and can really rip through some games with high frame rates. What really shocked me was the performance we managed to get out of an $800 gaming PC. Just for gaming, this PC is an absolute beast. Taking out the streaming, these are the frames per second we managed to hit on a selection of games at absolute max settings. I was really impressed that games like Call of Duty Black Ops 4 managed to hit 96.8 frames per second average, which is easily limitable down to 60 frames per second to allow you to have that overhead on your graphics card for super high quality NVENC streaming. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a notoriously GPU-heavy game, came in at 64.6 frames per second. And for me, Monster Hunter World hitting over 70 frames per second average blew my mind. With some tweaks to your graphics settings, you can easily hit 60 frames per second on any game you want to stream and get those super high-quality NVENC streams going out to your audience. This little monster turned out amazingly powerful for just $800. Previously, you'd have had to sacrifice a lot to even stream these kind of games for anything close to this price, but the new NVENC encoders allow budget builds like this to really shine. This single PC build can absolutely tear through many of the favorite stream games and really provide an amazing experience for both yourself as a gamer and your audience as viewers on Twitch or YouTube. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this build. Please let me know in the comments down below if you decide to make it yourself. I would love to see photos of your own build if you manage to follow this guide, and I will see you guys next time.